Okay, good evening. As we begin here with part 3 of our progressive revelation. Part 1 we just dealt with speaking of all of it. Last week we did Daniel's 70 weeks, or the first 69 anyway. And this week we're going to get into the Olivet Discourse. These are in Matthew, Mark, and Luke of the Gospels, where the disciples were asking Jesus for signs of the end times. And Jesus went through these, you'll find it in Matthew 24, Mark chapter 13, and Luke chapter 21. And a lot of pastors, when they're teaching on this, will tell you they're all basically the same thing, but I'm going to show you some differences between those. Matthew and Mark are really basically the same thing. Mark will add on a little information, but both Matthew and Mark were written to the Jews. Luke, the only Gentile writer of the Bible who also wrote the book of Acts, is going to deal with the Jewish Christians of that time. So what I'm going to do is we're just going to read through Matthew 24, Mark, I'll insert whatever little bit there is need to do, and then Luke we're going to go over and cover some of the major points. So in Matthew 24, beginning with verse 1, Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, and if you got a red letter edition, this is where Jesus' word will start. You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. And then Jesus is going to give them some signs at the end of ages. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the signs of your coming of the end of age? So this here, when you read over in Mark chapter 13, Jesus will actually give the disciples names, Peter, James, John, and Peter's brother Andrew. And they're like this inner circle that you see throughout the Gospels with the death of the daughter of the Roman, Transfiguration, Gethsemane. You'll see about this inner circle. After Matthew 13, Jesus did not speak out in public other than parables, except he had like a group of 70 followers, and he had his 12 disciples that most of you know of, and then his inner circle of the 3 or 4. Mark will bring up the names of those. Verse 4, and Jesus answered them, see that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars, rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, king against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All of these are the beginning of birth pains. So what you're going to see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is what this term is, the beginning of sorrows. And Jesus tells you in order, they're going to deal with the false Christ, war, famine, pestilences, and earthquakes. And if you do a study here, you're going to read about it in Matthew here 24, Luke 21, and you'll also see it in Revelation chapter 6, which we will go through in part 4 of our progressive revelation. Verse number 9. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death. So this is where we're getting the tribulation time. And you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake, and then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray, and because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. but the love who endures to the end will be saved, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations when the end will come. And then verse 15 of 24 will start the abomination of desolation. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let the one who's on the housetop not go down to take what is in the house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant, for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation. So this is where Jesus is talking about that last 3.5 year period, and this is where Jesus himself labels it the Great Tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now and never will be. For if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. For the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, and there he is, do not believe it, for a false Christ and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand, so if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. So in this abomination of desolation, you're going to see all the Jewishness here that they're speaking of. So this abomination of desolation, if you study the Hebrews of the Jews, you will know, and we'll get to it more in Jude, they had Luke, they had an abomination of desolation back in 167 BC with Antiochus IV, who named himself Antiochus Epiphanes, and that's where you had the Maccabean revolt, and that's where Antiochus did away with a lot of the Jewish offerings and all of that, and he did the temple, and the Maccabeans went in and rededicated the temple, and the Jews to this day observe that time as Hanukkah. But this abomination of desolation is going to be in the Great Tribulation, which we saw earlier, and where we studied some back with Daniel last week, and we touched on it in week 1 of our study in Progressive Revelation. So Daniel, he speaks about it over there in chapter 9 there at the end, where we saw the 69 weeks, and then 927 deals with the 70th week, and also in Daniel chapter 12, starting there in verse 1. And then you get to where what I would call a technology statement, because they're saying those in Judea flee to the mountains. So if you know anything about their sacrifices, they have a high priest who would go in once a year after great ceremonial cleansing on Yom Kippur, and he would do the sacrifice for the country. Well, Judea is quite a few miles away, so the only way that they would see this in Judea is where we're in, like this time now with CNN, where if something happens in any part of the world of any great importance, you know it's shown all over the world. So even though we're half a world away over here in the States, if something like that happened, we would actually see it here. So here is actually speaking of a technology statement of the end times. They tell you, let the one who's on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. The houses are over there. If you understand their living, the houses are all close together. The people entertained on the housetops. That's what they did in that day and age. They didn't have very big yards, so they would entertain on the housetops. The one who was in the field not turned back to get his cloak. So all this here, when you break it down, you're speaking of morning, noon, and night. So no matter what the time is, and the fields would be where they're working, on the housetops on the roof at night would be where they are entertaining, and in there in the morning time we read in the beginning. Verse 19 talks about the women who are pregnant, those who are nursing infants on those days. And then they sit there and say, pray that your flight may not be in winter. Over there in Judea, winter's a lot of snow, very hard to travel. Or on the Sabbath. This is where you're getting the Jewishness on this. You and I here in the States really don't deal with the Sabbath. This is a Jewish thing from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday, and they couldn't travel more than 1,000 feet from their home. So here on the Sabbath, you're hearing where this writing here is for the Jews. And then for there will be great tribulation, which I told you that's the last 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week. Or over in Jeremiah chapter 30, I believe it's like verse 7, where it's called the time of Jacob's trouble. Jacob, God changed his name to Israel there in the book of Genesis. And then Jesus tells you here how tough this tribulation is going to be. Because Jesus says, if the days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved for the sake of the elect. Those days will be short. The elect here is the Jewish people. If you study your World War II, you will learn that 1 out of 3 Jews died during the Holocaust. Well, the Great Tribulation here, if you go over to the book of Zechariah, chapter 13, verses 8 and 9, I believe that's the last 2 verses of that, you will read over there Zechariah's prophecy telling you that during this Great Tribulation and this Daniel 70th week, that 2 out of 3 Jews is going to die. So Jesus is telling you how bad this tribulation is going to be, but that last third is going to recognize Jesus as the Messiah finally, and then they will go on into eternity, and that's where Jesus is going to rule for that 1,000-year millennial reign. Verse 29 deals with the coming of the Son of Man, Jesus' second coming. So immediately after the tribulation, so after Daniel's 70th week, after the time of Jacob's trouble, after that tribulation of those days, the sun will be dark and the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the power of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So when you get over to Revelation chapter 19, verse number 11, you're going to see that second coming of God, and in the 4 winds, angels in the 4 corners are going to gather that last 1/3 that has not been killed, and we're going to bring it here for that. Verse number 32, the lesson from the fig tree. From the fig tree, learn its lessons. As soon as its branches become tender, put out its leaves. You know that the summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you will know that the end is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So back there early in Matthew, God tells you the seriousness of the word, not a yot or a tittle is going to be out of place. Then over here, verse 36, no one knows the day or the hour, but concerning the day or the hour, no one knows, even the angels in heaven, nor the Son. So at this spot where Jesus is speaking as a human here on earth, not even he knows the hour. My assumption is that he's back in heaven with his part of the Trinity back intact. He knows the day and the hour. But at this point where he's speaking to the disciples, even Jesus didn't know them, but the Father only. For as they were in the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So that with the coming of the Son of Man, the two men will be in the field, one will be taken, one left. Two women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken, one left. Therefore stay away, for you do not know on what day the Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would have not let his house be broken into. So there's a lot of different commentaries going on this too, as who's the one and who's the other one. That's not really important. If you have Jesus in your heart, you're going to be out of here. You're not even going to deal with the tribulation. Therefore you must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. So anytime you hear people giving you dates, times, or whatever, it's not a good thing, because the Bible here tells you no one knows except the Father. Who then, verse 45, who then is the faithful and the wise servant whom the master has set over the household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom the master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. Verse 48. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servant, and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of the servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and in an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him in with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So the big thing I want to bring up now here with Matthew is I want to go back to verse 9. Matthew 24 verse 9. So Jesus does all the signs of the end of age, and then he does this here. He tells you that all those signs there, verse 8, all these are the beginning of birth pains. So all this stuff here is going to happen, and then in verse 9, then they will deliver you up to tribulation. So then you're going to start that tribulation there. Now when we go over to Luke 21, we're not going to read the whole thing, but what I want you to see with Luke is over in verse 12, where Jesus is foretelling the wars and the persecutions. He's done all these beginning the sorrows, that which we spoke about earlier, the false Christ, the war, the famine, the pestilences, and the earthquakes. And then Jesus over here, just to back up a little bit, when Jesus is foretelling the wars and the persecutions, Jesus says, he says to them, nation will rise against nation, kingdom of kingdom, there will be great earthquakes in various places, famine, pestilences, and there will be terrors and great signs from the heaven. But what Luke does is, verse 12 says, before all of this, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prison, and you will be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake. This will be your opportunity to bear witness. Verse 14, settle in therefore in your minds not to meditate before how to answer, for I give you a mouth and wisdom which none of your adversaries will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be delivered up even by your parents and brothers, relatives and friends, and some of you will be put to death. Verse 17, you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but not a hair of your heads will perish, for your endurance will gain you in your lives. What you're having here is Jesus is getting them out of Jerusalem before the temple is destroyed, because when you read afterwards, starting with verse 20, Jesus is foretelling the destruction of Jerusalem. Luke, as I said in the beginning, was a Gentile writer. When you read about the dealings with Josephus and all of his stuff, you will read in there where basically 1 million plus Jewish Christians were saved because they read and understood this to be before. Jesus had predicted that the temple was going to be destroyed, not a stone upon another would be left standing. And for you history buffs, you'll learn that General Titus went over to Jerusalem in 70 AD and did exactly what Jesus here had predicted 38 years earlier. So Jesus had told them before all these beginning of sorrows. Matthew 24 does the sorrows and says, then this is going to happen. I don't know why commentators try to lump it all together, but it's not going to happen. The abomination of desolation that Luke is going to be speaking of is the one that Daniel had already predicted there